I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. The decision by Hamas to release an American mother and her 17-year-old daughter has no doubt given other families hope. The two were among those taken hostage during the brutal terrorist attack in southern Israel 2 weeks ago. There's no sign, however, Israel's about to drop its plans for a ground invasion of Gaza to wipe out Hamas. The Australian government and the Parliament have supported Israel's right to defend itself. But there's growing concern over the number of Palestinian civilians being killed even before any troops go in. Two ministers, Ed Husic and Anne Ali, went beyond the official line, accusing Israel of inflicting collective punishment on the people of Gaza. I'll be joined in a moment by the Shadow Foreign Minister Simon Birmingham. But first, the panel: Mark Kenny, Clare Armstrong and Tom Crowley. Look, let's just start on the latest developments there in Gaza. I'm really intrigued by Hamas releasing these two American hostages. Apparently Qatar was involved in brokering this deal and wants to negotiate further releases. Mark, why do you think Hamas would agree to release two Americans?
Well, I guess their backs are against the wall for a start. I mean, they're being bombarded. They're being, the population in Gaza is being pushed south. The Israelis are amassing on the border for this massive invasion. So the circumstances they face are pretty dire. This is the storm that they unleashed on themselves, that Hamas unleashed on themselves with those appalling attacks on October 7. But if we look at it from the sort of strategic point of view, I think what they're trying to do is now garner some support. They can see there's actually a fair bit of support around the world, and certainly in the Arab world, for the plight of the Palestinian people, if not for Hamas itself, of course. So there's a little bit of politics being played, a little bit of deft politics, and there's even been some signalling that they might be prepared to release some more hostages if the Israelis are prepared to halt their advance.
Well, perhaps that's part of the aim here, to try and pressure Israel into holding off on the ground invasion. But Claire, there's no sign that Israel is about to call this off or pause for much longer.
No, I think it's important to note that the incursion hasn't taken place yet, though. That's significant. There's been considerable diplomatic efforts. We saw with US President Joe Biden and European leaders actually going to Tel Aviv, yes, to show support for Israel, but also very clear in their language around making sure that particularly the humanitarian crisis aspect, but also the more regional that this doesn't spill over into a more regional conflict with, Syria and Hezbollah in the north, obviously Iran being involved. So I don't think there's any suggestion that Israel are not going to go ahead with this, but it does seem that at times some cooler heads have prevailed while some of these trickier issues are being worked through.
Look, President Biden, we know, made that quick visit there to Israel. The other meeting that he had scheduled with some of those other regional players was called off. It was interesting, I thought, this comment from Joe Biden, a message to Israel about the need not to be consumed by their rage over this.
I caution this: while you feel that rage, don't be consumed by it. After 9/11, we were enraged in the United States. While we sought justice and got justice, we also made mistakes.
So, Tom, it's an interesting sentiment there, isn't it, that you don't be consumed by the rage and the mistakes. Presumably he's referring to the decision to go to war in Iraq, something he opposed from the outset. But how do you think that sort of message is going to be received in Israel?
Well, I think it's a clear warning to Israel as it ponders this ground invasion, to be clear about both what its objective is, clearly to destroy Hamas, but also how it thinks that objective can be achieved. Because, ground campaign is going to be long. Urban warfare, we know, is difficult. It's not an easy thing to root out an ideology in a political movement such as Hamas in the context of a ground invasion. And we know, as we're already seeing, that the civilian toll, the toll from soldiers on both sides, will only mount significantly as the ground invasion comes. So I think it's sort of, coded language. Biden's clearly walking a line, but that warning there to just consider carefully the humanitarian consequences of all actions. The other thing that came out of that meeting, of course, with Biden and Netanyahu was the aid trucks which have finally made their way into Gaza. It's sort of several days. It's taken a long time. I think that shows why it's important for the global community to keep putting the pressure on Hamas, on Israel, on Egypt, on all of the different parties here to make sure that humanitarian aid gets where it's needed, because we know it's still not enough.
Yeah, and look, some has gone in, but clearly the situation in Gaza is is awful.
Can we just put that into context, though, in terms of what's gone in? 20 trucks, right? Normally, Gaza's, often described as the world's largest open-air prison. It is an entirely controlled border by Israel and its enemies. So, 20 trucks are going in, right? Normally, 400 trucks go in daily to provide services for people living in Gaza. That's what's needed. There's hardly any industry there. There's 2.2 million people in there. And now they've let 20 trucks in. So yes, it's a small thing. Yes, it's something. It's quite significant, but it's quite a small thing, and it's taken a long time. And the reports now suggest that starvation is a genuine problem, that people are right now on the edge of starving. So it is a huge humanitarian crisis. And it's no wonder that cooler heads are advising Israel to slow down and looking for some way to address this burgeoning problem.
And it's because of that situation in Gaza that we saw two members of the Albanese government ministry speak out, not only expressing concern for the civilians in Gaza, but criticising what Israel's doing.
I feel very strongly that Palestinians are being collectively punished here for Hamas's barbarism. I really do feel that there is an obligation on governments, particularly the Israeli government, to, as we have said, follow the rules of international law and to observe, in particular, that innocents should be protected.
Do you believe that Israel has committed war crimes?
Well, I think that is something that is possibly something that could be investigated. And I think that any state or any group that commits war crimes should be investigated and should be held accountable.
Well, collective punishment is technically a war crime according to the Geneva Convention, but they were careful not to use those words themselves. The opposition, well, certainly the Deputy Opposition Leader Susan Lee leapt on this, a split in the government, she called it. Claire, is it a split? And, well, how significant or how important is it, I suppose, that there's division on this?
A spectrum, maybe, of opinion within the party, also a spectrum of who these MPs and ministers maybe are trying to speak to within Australia. Obviously, it's politically expedient to talk about this being a black and white division, but I think it's not my understanding that this was some kind of pre-arranged, pre-endorsed running out of, pushing the boat out on this because someone had to do it. I think it came from a very genuine place. I think you can see when Minister Husic is speaking there that his comments come from a very genuine place, and maybe it's as much about the emphasis that these two ministers were putting on the broader conflict, and maybe we need to think a little bit as well as the public and as media about the emphasis we put on the contribution from, say, an Australian Muslim politician than we might have if, there are many other Labor politicians who have a large Muslim population in their electorates. Would we have put as much emphasis on the words of a Jason Clare, of a Tony Burke? It's hard to say. So maybe retrospectively, this has now been sort of greenlit by the government. We saw Ed Husic repeat his comments this morning that he does stand by this idea that the Palestinian civilians are being caught up in this unfairly. So it's not like he's walked it back, and we probably had to expect there would be someone say something.
And he did actually use the term collectively punished. So
yes,
he's making a very serious point. But I like your point about spectrum. I think it being a spectrum. I also think it's just a degree of ethical consistency. If you're appalled at what happened on October 7, you're also appalled at what could happen, and it's material to be saying so before it could happen in a way that might hopefully forestall it, that might prevent it from happening. So that's what Israel's being counselled to do, is to take care so that we don't see the scale of human suffering exponentially increased by the might of Israel and the anger of Israel, the understandable anger of Israel, but the result of which could be death and suffering on an absolutely colossal scale. And of course, anyone who's not appalled by that, I think they should start looking in the ethical mirror themselves if such a thing exists.
Look, it's interesting within Labor, talking to various ministers, some say they wouldn't have used those words collective punishment, but none that I've spoken to are terribly upset that they said this. They see it's important for social cohesion reasons as well,
yes,
to be saying this sort of thing, because they know that Muslim communities are really aggrieved by what they're seeing, and they want to see that Australia's not just taking one side, as it were, in this. But Tom, the opposition's argument here is that there needs to be just one line coming from the Albanese government, coming from the Australian government at this time.
Well, yeah, I just don't think that that's a realistic reflection of the role that the Australian government has to be able to play to all Australians at this time. You know, we know that there are so many Australians who have a connection to civilians who would have died in Israel in the initial attack, who needed to hear from the government that expression of solidarity and standing with them. But equally, there are many Australians who will know people currently in Gaza who'll be desperately fearful for the situation that civilians are facing there. And they also need to hear from their government a sense that those civilian lives matter, that all civilian lives do.
I would just add to that as well. Anne Ali, before she came into Parliament, her bread and butter was counter-terrorism. She is an expert in this area, and she just is not the kind of person that would say anything without being very carefully considered about the audience she was trying to reach and why.
And Mike Burgess recently made those comments about
the ASIO
words, the ASIO boss, right? That words matter, and I think what he was saying here is, look, there are sort of social cohesion implications of this, and that speaks to the possibility of security implications of this. If people feel alienated, if they feel their government is not representing them, if they feel that one side of this protracted and awful conflict is being advocated and the other side is being ignored.
And the government did also collectively vote for the motion that was put before Parliament at the start of the week, which was recognising Israel's right to defend itself and condemning the attacks by Hamas. So as much as we're having this sort of nuanced debate out in public, when, you know, it came to a vote, the government all stood on that side of the bench with the coalition on that issue.
What about Peter Dutton's suggestion that the Prime Minister should be visiting Israel personally? And look, a couple of leaders have, obviously Joe Biden, Rishi Sunak has, I think the European Commission leader might have gone as well, but it's not like a whole stack of world leaders are rushing to Jerusalem or Tel Aviv. Tom, what do you think that was about?
Yeah, I mean, a fair bit of politics in that as well, I think. You know, as you say, I mean, the UK and the US, it's been pointed out, are permanent members of the Security Council. There's an additional role that they play there in terms of overseeing any global conflict. Australia doesn't have that, I think.
And they have a long-standing sort of history of importance in Israel itself, in that part of the world.
Yeah, they do, and we're not the main characters here. And so, and obviously, I mean, the difficulty of Joe Biden's visit, as we saw, was that he went, you know, intending to meet with both Benjamin Netanyahu and Arab leaders, and then, you know, in the time that he arrived and the complication on the ground, he wasn't able to do that in the end. It was a challenging thing for the President of the United States to manage the optics.
Also a big security operation. They've got a couple of aircraft carriers parked off the coast.
There's a lot that can go wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
Pretty amazing, actually. I mean, it's worth pointing out, it's pretty amazing that the US President made a visit like that at such short notice. It was a very significant intervention. And I think what was clever about it, what was quite deft about it, and this goes to Biden's long experience and his extensive experience in international affairs, is that they cloaked it very strongly in this standing with our friends, standing with Israel, expressing solidarity, all of that. But you can actually see that the real purpose of the mission was, as was represented in that grab you played earlier, was about the Americans saying, now just slow down here. I mean, one of the things about what's happening in Hamas is they're not going anywhere, right? They're going to still be there. Take some time here. Be careful how you go, because if Israel is already starting to lose the PR war around the world, at least in parts of the world where, you know, they aren't fanatically sort of pro-Israel to begin with, and Israel can do damage to itself, to its reputation, and to its security long term if it moves too quickly here and acts too decisively. It would, as I said, will damage its relationship, but it could also lead to that problem, the one that Biden's referring to, which is, you know, we've gone in, we've decapitated regimes before, and we've left a vacuum, and now look at it. Look at Afghanistan, look at Iraq. So be careful here. What's your plan? What's your whole plan?
Well, to that end, time to talk to the Shadow Foreign Minister, Simon Birmingham, to take us there. He was the UN Secretary-General, calling for Hamas to release Israeli hostages and for Israel to allow unrestricted access to humanitarian aid into Gaza.
But those attacks cannot justify the collective punishment of the Palestinian people. Each of my two humanitarian appeals have a value in themselves. They are not bargaining chips. They are simply the right things to do. And I am horrified by the hundreds of people killed at Al-Ahli Hospital this same day in Gaza by a strike that I strongly condemned earlier today. I call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire to provide sufficient time and space to help realise my two appeals and to ease the epic human suffering we are witnessing.
Simon Birmingham, welcome to the program.
Good morning, David. Good to be with you.
Is Israel, in your view, engaging in collective punishment of Palestinian citizens?
No, it's not, David, and it's important that we do not allow moral equivalence to be drawn or to be sought to be drawn. The attacks of Hamas against Israel were horrific. They were targeting babies, children, the elderly and others, and they were targeting them because they are Jews. Israel is acting in self-defence, as Australia and many other countries around the world have recognised their right to do so. Israel is seeking to disable Hamas and its ability to be able to operate as a terrorist threat in the future, and that is exactly something that we should continue to support, while of course wanting to see Israel operate in ways that protect innocent lives as much as possible. And it is notable that they have provided warnings in relation to different activities undertaken, that they've also shown restraint over recent days, in fact now the last couple of weeks, in terms of the timing of when any ground movements occur. And it's very welcome to see that first movement of humanitarian assistance going into the region.
So to those who are concerned about what's unfolding in Gaza, the thousands of deaths there, including many children, your argument is this is just an unfortunate consequence of Israel defending itself.
Well, the loss of all human life in an innocent context is of course tragic, and our heart goes out to absolutely everyone, be they Israeli or Palestinian, who are seeing loss of loved ones. But we have now for years seen Hamas, a terrorist organisation, engage in terrorist activities and also use the fact that it has been able to operate almost freely in Gaza, to build up in terms of a sense of governance, a capacity to undertake this horrific strike against Israel 2 weeks ago. They continue to hold a couple of hundred hostages, and so Israel is well within its rights to defend itself. That is an inherent right it has. And critically, for its future and the protection of others and for the well-being of Palestinian people, Israel is within its rights to seek to remove Hamas from an ability to undertake such strikes in the future, and hopefully from an ability to be able to rule over people living in Gaza as well. Because if we are to ultimately see a situation where Israelis and Palestinians are in a position to be able to talk, to negotiate, and to finally live peacefully side by side with one another, then there needs to be a structure other than Hamas in place to be able to negotiate with. You can't negotiate with terrorists in this type of instance. You can't expect to get improved outcomes. And what we've seen by Hamas sitting in power for so long and building its capabilities and capacity is this tragic, abhorrent action that has taken so many lives and is now causing so much human suffering.
But is it justified to cut off all of those supplies, energy, food, water? Is that justified?
Israel, of course, is trying to work through what is an incredibly complex problem in terms of how they disable Hamas, how they remove them from power. We want to see humanitarian support available. We want to see individuals who are innocent individuals, children and others in Palestine, in Palestinian areas in Gaza, able to access the types of humanitarian support in food, in water, in medicines that you would hope for. And of course, one of the fastest ways to see that sort of breakthrough occur would be for a wholesale release of those people still being held hostage by Hamas.
But until that happens,
to see a couple of people released overnight, but to get the types of breakthroughs in talks between Egypt, between Israel, to get the flows into Gaza that could occur, a big breakthrough could, I'm sure, be achieved if we saw that release, wholesale release of all of the couple of hundred, 210 it is estimated, individuals being held hostage.
Well, that would of course be wonderful, but if that doesn't happen, my question is, are those restrictions on food and energy and water justified?
Again, Israel is dealing with a very complex situation. I'm not going to prejudge their military strategy. Egypt is a key player.
You can say whether it's justified or not in doing what it's doing.
No, Egypt is a key player here as well in terms of their willingness to have the Rafah border open and what they are willing to see cross in both directions of that border.
No, but this comes back to the whole question point about whether Israel is collectively punishing civilians in Gaza. You're unwilling to say whether it's justified in what it's doing.
At present, Israel is well within its rights to act in ways that seek to disable Hamas and to remove it from the position to be able to undertake future terrorist
including
attacks.
Cutting off the food and water and energy.
We want to see humanitarian support. We want to see innocent civilians able to access food, water, medicines, and for that, if we could see the release of hostages, if we could see a flow of those supplies over the Rafah border crossing with Egypt, that would provide the types of breakthroughs while still enabling Israel to remove a threat that exists to itself and a threat that has undermined any prospect of peace for many, many years now.
You've been highly critical of Iran for its role in funding and empowering both Hamas and Hezbollah. You warned in Parliament during the week that we shouldn't be 5 or 10 years from now asking, what if? Could we have done more to prevent Iran unleashing atrocities, including nuclear atrocities? What are you suggesting we should be doing right now in relation to Iran?
David, if we look at the terrible events that have struck the world over the last couple of years, it's evident that bad faith actors don't get better with time. President Putin in Russia, way back in 2014, assaulted Crimea, launched invasion into Crimea. He shot down, of course, a Malaysia Airlines flight carrying civilians, including many Australians. And yet the world kept trying to find ways to deal with Putin, and then ultimately we faced the wholesale invasion of Ukraine last year. In the case of Hamas, they have now governed Gaza, as we've been discussing, for a long period of time, many atrocities undertaken in that time. And Iran, sadly, has an even longer track record in many ways of human rights abuses against its own people, of mobilising terrorist activities such as Hamas or Hezbollah. And so we ought to be looking at the types of actions that can be taken, listing the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps as a terrorist organisation, working as comprehensively as we can with other nations to ensure the sanctions regime is as tight as possible on Iran, to try to ensure that we limit their capacity to spread evil, to spread terror, and ultimately supporting the many brave Iranian people who have sought to see a change of regime in that country.
So you think the Revolutionary Guard should be a prescribed terrorist organisation by Australia?
The Coalition does believe that should be the case. The IRGC sponsors terrorist activities around the world. Iran has been responsible in terms of driving and enabling Hamas, Hezbollah, and the IRGC itself operates in ways that oppresses Iranian people, particularly women and girls we've seen suffering for a long period of time, and yet showing such courage over the last couple of years since the murder of Mahsa Amini. The Senate committee looking at these matters recommended that the government should pursue listing of the IRGC, and if that requires changes to Australian legislation, then the government would have bipartisan support from the opposition to do that.
Final one on this issue. Peter Dutton's criticised Anthony Albanese for not going to visit Israel himself. Just explain to us why you think an Australian Prime Minister would be needed in Israel right now.
This is a time for world leaders to ensure that they demonstrate support for Israel and also that they, in demonstrating that support, engage in ways that can help to ensure the removal of Hamas, but also the respect of international law and of humanitarian access. And yes, we've seen the US President and the British Prime Minister. We've also seen the German Chancellor, the EU Commission President. We've seen leaders of Romania, the Foreign Minister of Canada and Italy. There are a number of leaders and countries, not all of whom, as the government has suggested, are members of the permanent 5 seats on the UN Security Council. A visit by the Australian Prime Minister, who is already going overseas this week, would be able to show our
part of the world, to be
solidarity.
fair. Are any Jewish groups actually suggesting this, or is this more about politics on the part of the coalition?
It's certainly been raised with me that a visit by the Prime Minister, or at the very least a senior minister of the Australian government to Israel, would be very welcomed by Australia's Jewish community. Well, I'm not going to go into the private conversations of each of my discussions with members of the Jewish Australian community, but I have had different conversations with those different organisations who have indicated it would be welcomed by them. And I am sure it would be seen as a strong statement of solidarity with Israel at this very difficult time.
Well, the Prime Minister is going to Washington later today for an official visit. Can you just clarify, does the opposition think he should be going?
The Prime Minister should, of course, engage internationally, and the fact that he has received this invitation from the US is one that it's appropriate for a Prime Minister to take up. So that's welcome. In visiting the US, he should make sure that he has a serious agenda, one that is seeking to ensure in relation to AUKUS that Australia's interests are protected, that we are seeing delivery of the legislation enabling the flow of technology, of materials and of people as quickly as possible to deliver upon the AUKUS commitments. He should also be, of course, clear in standing alongside President Biden that Australia's position in relation to Israel and the Middle East conflict underway is in lockstep. And I would also urge the Prime Minister to use this time and this trip to make clear Australia's support for continued United States support for Ukraine, that conflict and that war should not be left to slide, that the strong statements made by President Biden about the interconnectedness of the different conflicts and challenges we see around the world is something that Australia should pick up on and make sure that we are clear-cut in our support for standing against Russian aggression in defence of the rules-based order
because
and in defence of the sovereignty of nations like Ukraine.
There is debate, as you know, in the US amongst Republicans over whether to keep supporting Ukraine. You're suggesting that the Australian Prime Minister should tell the Americans when he's there what to do.
The Australian Prime Minister should always be cautious not to enter into domestic political matters when visiting other countries. But this goes to the consistency of our foreign policy and what we hope for from all of our allies and partners around the world. And so continued support for Ukraine is an important feature that Australia should continue to deliver, and that we should be looking for all of our partners, particularly those NATO nations led by the United States, and to continue to provide that support for Ukraine so that we are not entering a situation where a bad faith actor like Russia is ultimately able to prevail or partially prevail against a sovereign nation like Ukraine, and therefore undermine not only confidence in the rules-based order, but if they were allowed to prevail because others had stepped back, it would also be sending a terrible signal to other potential bad faith actors around the world.
A couple of other quick ones. China has agreed to review the tariffs it's imposed on Australian wine. Australia's agreed to suspend its WTO action while that review is underway. Do you welcome that breakthrough?
It's welcome, but these tariffs should never have been put in place in the first place. It was an attempted economic coercion by China. The tariffs were never justified, and it is no doubt no coincidence that China and Australia received the draft report from the World Trade Organisation into Australia's appeal against these tariffs only in the last week. I am confident that draft report would have found that these tariffs were an act against the rules of the WTO. They are clearly in breach of the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement and the undertakings that China had given to Australia. And so they should not just be reviewed, but they should be removed, and removed forthwith.
And finally, a week on from the Voice referendum defeat, can you just clear up for us what the Liberal Party's position is now on constitutional recognition?
We continue to support constitutional recognition, but it is clear that to take another proposal forward at some stage into the future will require very widespread consensus and will require a lot of engagement and cooperation. So to be able to put timing around that or indeed wording around that would be very preemptive at this stage, just 1 week on from the referendum. I think the referendum demonstrated that Australians put a premium and a priority on practical action, and that is where work in terms of auditing the expenditure across all areas of Indigenous programs is a way to ensure that is focused on practical outcomes and greater effectiveness and efficacy across those programs. Work in terms of undertaking a Royal Commission into child sexual abuse would be a way of focusing on getting more practical steps and outcomes to tackle that terrible, terrible scourge that occurs.
Most of the Indigenous health and child welfare groups disagree on that, and so does your colleague Bridget Archer. She crossed the floor in relation to this idea of a royal commission. She told The Guardian Peter Dutton appeared to be weaponising child abuse for some perceived political advantage. Is he?
No, Bridget is a dear friend and colleague, and I respect her, and particularly in relation to child sexual abuse. She brings a very personal understanding of these issues. However, there are clear challenges that exist. The work of the Northern Territory Children's
But there are in
Commissioner
many communities.
over the recent years.
Her point, sorry to butt in there, her point is why just Indigenous communities? Why not look at sex abuse in all communities?
Well, David, that's exactly what I was answering and addressing when you butted in, and that is the work of the Northern Territory Children's Commissioner has seen a significant surge in terms of reported instances of abuse or concern, some 30,000 additional reports in terms of concern, around 10% of those in that report identified as being child sexual abuse matters. So there are issues that are sadly on the rise, that are particular in terms of remote communities, and that is a tragedy that ought to be pursued and addressed in a thoughtful, calm way, and ought to be something that could have the support across the political landscape to be undertaken.
But are you talking about a royal commission into just remote communities or into child sex abuse broadly?
Oh, David, again, the terms of reference are something that would be, I imagine, drafted in consultation, ideally with the Northern Territory and preferably with other states. But I think one thing we've seen about royal commissions...
It could be broader than just remote communities.
I think one thing we've seen in terms of royal commissions is that recent ones that have been very, very broad can take a very long time and can become incredibly complex in their undertaking. So the more focused you can make a royal commission, the more effective, I believe, its outcomes and approach is likely to be.
All right, but you're open to a broader look at not just Indigenous communities?
Well, an effective approach in terms of Royal Commission would be to have the cooperation of states and territories to look at child sexual abuse in Indigenous communities and to make sure that it was really focused where the problems were seen as most significant. The evidence in the Northern Territory shows that there has been that spike and that there are real problems to be addressed, and that's why we ought to do so, but do so in a calm and proper manner.
Simon Birmingham, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, David. My pleasure.
All right, we are going to turn to The Voice shortly, and we'll also cross to our Indigenous Affairs correspondent, Carly Williams, who's been spending some time in Yarrabah over the last few days, getting some reaction to the fallout from this referendum as well. First, let's continue the discussion, just pick up on some of those points on the Middle East there with our panel, Mark Kenny, Clare Armstrong, Tom Crowley again. Mark, just coming back to this debate around Israel's justification for what it's doing. Clearly, Simon Birmingham does not agree with the collective punishment line, but it was interesting that he was, a little cautious in defending what Israel has done in cutting off supplies to Gaza.
Yeah, and I think that's what we actually need in this debate, is a little bit of nuance, a little bit of understanding that this is not some sort of moral binary. You go back to the grab of Susan Lee saying to Jason Clare, we want to hear your clear condemnation of it. We want to hear you either utter those words or not. I mean, so much of this debate is being conducted like it's some sort of test to show whether you are fully committed to Israel or you are not, as if that's the only thing that really
is that where this idea that the PM must go to Israel?
Yeah, I mean, precisely. That would be just a gesture, and it would be a gesture of a sort of a political statement of support for Israel. That's why I think it's what I was saying about what Biden did, is he sort of cleverly buried some fairly sensible messaging inside what was what looked like a gesture of solidarity.
Gesture of
support. So I think that it's good to see that there is starting to become in the political community some reflection of the realities of this and the human rights of people who are completely defenceless and really just pawns between extremists.
All right, well, let's turn now to the fallout from the Voice referendum. Indigenous leaders have largely observed a week of silence after this referendum defeat. That's no doubt helped the government as it tries to work out, gives it a bit of time to work out where it wants to go next. On the ground in Indigenous communities, however, clearly the failure of this referendum is being keenly felt. Our Indigenous Affairs correspondent, Carly Williams, as mentioned, is in Yarrabah on Kunganji country in Queensland and joins us now. Carly, thanks so much for joining us. Look, we mentioned earlier some of the divisions amongst those drafting an open letter in response to the vote. You've been there the last few days. What are you picking up in terms of the response?
Well, I think there's always going to be mixed views when what people are fighting for is so meaningful to them and so much is at stake. Yarrabah had a massive yes vote here, and elders say Yarrabah had the same amount of time to get across the detail of the voice than the rest of Australia, and that's why it was so hurtful when nearly 7 out of 10 Queenslanders voted no to the voice. Now, Elder Percy Neal says that we should have had truth-telling first, and that way the whole of Australia would have been educated on Indigenous history before the vote. I think people are grieving here in Yarrabah still, and unfortunately, for those who have been around long enough, that feeling is all too familiar.
And the Prime Minister, we know, wants to give Indigenous people time to process the result and then consult them on the next steps. What, in terms of these next steps, what are those there in Yarrabah looking at, do you think?
Yarrabah Mayor Ross Matthews wants the federal government to implement the Uluru Statement in full. Yes, the voice has failed, but he still wants truth-telling and treaty implemented by the government, and that will help tackle some of the housing issues in Yarrabah. There is 4,000 people living here in 400 houses. He also wants the continuation of the Closing the Gap strategy to get us up to treaty, because that could take years.
Yeah, well, it sounds like the reaction from a lot of politicians is to be fairly cautious now. Is there a concern that this result could also be a setback for state-based treaties?
It's deeply confusing that these mixed messages came out last week, just days after that bruising referendum result. We saw the Queensland Liberal National Party withdraw its support for Path to Treaty, even though it is legislated in Queensland. Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk then said that treaty could take years and it would need bipartisan support. Leaders in Yarrabah are saying that the withdrawal of bipartisan support on these issues is a political strategy, and it could happen in any jurisdiction for any sort of Indigenous reforms. I think traditional owner here, Arnie Janine, her message to Anastasia Palaszczuk was clear when she said, "Sis, you don't need them. You don't need bipartisan support."
And look, finally, we were just talking, Carly, about Peter Dutton calling for a royal commission into child sex abuse in Indigenous communities. How do locals there view that idea?
Well, the executive of the Gurani Yallamaka Health Service here in Yarrabah, Suzanne Andrews, said she was baffled by these calls for a royal commission, because she said there is a lot of reports existing already on this issue. We do know that we've got recent data from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare that says Indigenous children are less likely to be the subject of a substantiated notification of child abuse than non-Indigenous kids. Suzanne Andrews says that targeting Aboriginal children like this is harmful.
Think about what these children are hearing and thinking about themselves, you know. Stop using our communities as political football for your cause to move forward or to get votes.
And David, I think the challenge now for governments is rebuilding trust with First Nations Australians, and that seems like it's harder than ever, considering the flat-out rejection of the Indigenous-led voice proposal. I think in community there's a feeling here of let's regroup, let's re-strategise, but the referendum results and those booth-by-booth numbers tell a story, David, and that is that remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities are united.
Carly Williams, good to talk to you. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. Well, just looking, I guess we start with where things are at in terms of the federal government a week on from this result. Claire, where has this defeat of the voice left its overall policy on Indigenous Australians?
Exactly where it was a week ago, except without this vehicle, this mechanism to move forward. There's been criticism of the government for not emerging first thing Monday morning with a plan B. I mean, the Prime Minister did warn that that was there wasn't a plan B. It would have been slightly disingenuous if they'd brought out a folder and said, look, we preempted the failure of this huge undertaking. I think what's really significant and what's important to note is that we actually are no closer to understanding what this means for the government, what this means for Indigenous communities than we were this time a week ago. And a large part of that is to do with respect for that week of silence, and the government has been respectful of that. And another part of that is because you forget, yes, for many Australians, this was weeks, months, maybe a year of their lives paying attention to. For Indigenous leadership in this country, it was almost decades of constitutional recognition, 6 years from the Uluru Statement of the Heart. To expect that we just have a pathway out of this immediately, I think, was always unreasonable. The point I would make just quickly is that in that week of silence, I think it was incumbent on Australia's elected officials to hold the line on issues that had already been advanced outside the Voice, and we saw an abject failure, I think, of politicians across the state.
Well, just on that, the PM was asked a number of times, what about those other elements of the Uluru Statement in full that he had committed to? Here's what he said.
Is the Prime Minister committed to Makarrata truth-telling and treaty?
What I'm committed to post the referendum is respecting what Indigenous people have said. And what they have said is that they are undertaking a week, which is reasonable for them to deal with what for many people it will be a difficult time for them. And I think that should be respected.
Yeah, and look, I think plenty will agree that it's fair enough to take some time here, but those commitments, in fact, money was committed to the Makarrata process as well. What's the status of that now?
Well, I mean, your money was committed to the process. It's just hard for me to see truth-telling and treaty proceeding as they were originally, envisaged in the Uluru Statement, because the concept of Makarrata being coming together after a struggle, well, the result of the referendum shows we're still in the struggle. And I think, truth-telling is being sort of spoken about now as a way to, in a sense, correct the electorate. And, perhaps if people had understood more about their history, we would have got a different referendum result. That's very different to the spirit that it was in Uluru, which was about this sort of joining of hands, moving together, a mutual recognition that the whole country wants to grapple with this history, heal this national wound. That hasn't happened. So whatever comes now has a different tone and has to have a different tone to the sort of unity and generosity that was in the original Uluru Statement. That doesn't exist, that can't exist anymore. And I think we're in a position now where I think the major parties are philosophically, fundamentally at odds on Indigenous policy. And I think, you mentioned there, Claire, that, where does this end? Because the argument that gets made in the referendum about that it's, wrong in the Constitution to draw a special distinction for Indigenous people as far as a voice, you can extend that to closing the gap. The whole architecture of government responsibility to address Indigenous disadvantage may start to be called into question. I think that's all now fair game as far as the coalition.
Are politicians at the state level as well, Mark, a bit spooked by this outcome when you look at where they're going now on treaty and even state-based voice bodies?
Well, it's an astonishing result. When you look at the votes around the country, you look at all of the states voting no, you look at the margin by which voters rejected this proposition, it says to those state governments, who thought they had sort of something around 50 or 60% support for the procedures they were going through for their state-based voices and the like, it says to them that the public sentiment is quite different. So I think that naturally it's going to have that political effect, and we'll see a degree of political cowardice, I suppose, or retreat might be a better way of putting it. Whether we like it or not, that's politics. But I think on the question of treaty, I just think there's so much sort of overheated rhetoric around this idea of treaty. Treaties are agreements between parties. You can't get forced into a treaty. There's nothing wrong with actually opening up negotiations, having a truth-telling process and arriving at some sort of accommodation. Whether it's actually achievable or not, that's another question.
I would just build on that. The danger, and what I was referring to before, the danger with this is an over-interpretation of this referendum result. Australians didn't go to the ballot box to vote on treaty as much as some parties might have tried to make it that happen. We saw this week former Prime Minister Tony Abbott even questioned the future of flying the Indigenous flag next to the Australian flag or having a welcome to country. Now, I beggars belief that you could be driving over the Sydney Harbour Bridge, look up and think, I'm losing something here by having this fly above me. But it is genuinely really dangerous for Indigenous affairs in this country if one result on one specific proposal is used as political cover to not do things that are hard, to not do things that require a bit of moral courage. It's actually really incumbent on politicians right now to not just say it's too hard.
Dead right.
But I think that's difficult when the Shadow Indigenous Affairs spokesperson, made clear a view during the campaign that no one in the coalition was really willing to rebut, that there was no intergenerational trauma, no ongoing negative legacy due to colonisation. The natural extension of that view does call into question a lot of the traditional bipartisan positions. It was Scott Morrison who led the Closing the Gap refresh a few years ago. I think it's not clear that that position is going to hold for the coalition now.
All right, well, our panel, Tom Crowley, Clare Armstrong, Mark Kenny. We'll be back very shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with cartoonist for the Canberra Times and ACM, the one and only David Pope, and a very warm welcome to a lovely spring morning.
It's beautiful out here, Mike.
Yep.
Nice to see you.
David, the voters have spoken and the majority have said no to The Voice. Has it been a hard week to cartoon?
Look, yeah, it has been, and it's because there's a sort of general grumbly mood about the result.
There's a grumbly undercurrent.
Yeah, definitely.
Really. Mark Knight's picked up on that with Yeah Nah.
I found this the most interesting cartoon of the week because it captures what happened, but it also kind of captures the frame of the whole debate. So you've got the political class depicted as saying yes, and you've got this Indigenous face saying no, and that's the framing of no, and that's what ended up succeeding.
As the Parliament opened up after the referendum, Jacinta Price came into the Senate and Bridget McKenzie greeted her with much warmth.
Yeah, so this would have been the character you were focused on with your lens when they came in.
For a coalition that says we take no joy in this result, it certainly looked a bit joyful.
A bit of joy.
Matt Golding cartoon, the Uluru statement from the heart, flatlining is sort of almost needs a beep sound effect.
That's very depressing. That cartoon. That's the question. Are the other elements in trouble as well?
Yeah, well, that's right. And Megan Herbert has picked up on that. Voice has crossed out Truth and Treaty to go.
I saw this cartoon in the paper immediately after the referendum, and it was clearly a message. It's about the other elements of the Uluru statement. It came across to me as an attempt of sort of trying to put arms around people. It's interesting, we've got this period now where the Indigenous leaders around the Yes campaign have taken a week to reflect, which is a really rare thing in politics. I mean, we're in the business here of, we're used to instant sound bites and instant opinions on stuff.
Yeah.
And people are going to take some time to think about something.
I did love David Rowe. Good morning, Australia, as Peter Dutton is wiping the mist off. The squeak, squeak, squeak.
Hello, Australia. Have a look at yourself in the mirror.
I love this division pour homme. In the way that he does sometimes, he brings together these very complicated things in such a ridiculous way.
It's very visceral, this cartoon too. I can hear the squeak.
Yeah, me
I
too.
I can feel the steam. And I can see the face looming through the mist.
Brett Lethbridge seems to think that it's a very small target, my referendum. Well, it remains a target here on the floor.
This is a lovely cartoon. I mean, when Dutton promised a second referendum, he didn't believe it, we didn't believe him, we didn't believe he believed it. He hasn't even put it in the basket. Like, we know it's dead, but it's just...
He's missed. David, the war in Gaza might be a long way away, but it was still causing a lot of friction in Capitol Hill this week. I did love this cartoon from you, Aiming Higher, it's titled, Ceasefire Call, No War on Gaza. The dove of peace here is looking a little bit haggard.
Yeah, it's faced with the terrible humanitarian disaster that's unfolding in Gaza.
You've depicted Ed Husick here beautifully. Why is Labor so divided, says Susan Lee.
He spoke very strongly and emotionally about holding all victims in this conflict close.
Close, yeah.
And so I just tried to visually depict that, especially when he's been attacked as though this is some sort of division that is unacceptable, that we can't have nuance in debate and we can't think about context or talk about context in this debate.
David, it's been a great pleasure unpicking the events this week, even though the material has been quite depressing and heavy.
It's always good to talk to you about these things, Mike, and back to you, David.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Mike, as well. Let's get some final observations from the panel. Tom.
Very big inflation numbers coming out on Wednesday for the September quarter. We've had obviously another shock to global oil prices. Michelle Bullock's talking about shock after shock after shock. Those shocks on their own won't push the RBA to move, but if Wednesday's numbers show that domestic demand is not coming in the way the RBA wants, we're on this very narrow glide path and they might move again with a cup day rate rise.
Yeah, more concerns for the government there. Claire?
A lot to be said about what Australia can and can't do in relation to this Israel-Hamas conflict. Last week, Defence Minister Richard Marles was in South Korea, he was in Japan, and gave a very clear message to our allies in the region that unlike 20 years ago when terrorism took the world's attention to the Middle East and created a vacuum in our own region, we are very aware and attuned to the fact that there are leaders in China and also Russia, but particularly China, that do look to make the most of a distracted West, and we are not going to let that happen this time.
Mark?
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. They're the big winners out of all of this instability for sure, and Iran as well. Yeah, I was just intrigued by Simon Birmingham's term, the interconnectedness of Ukraine. I think it's an important point to make, but I think this is a real test of the West, its commitment to principles like human rights, the rule of law, self-determination and the like. So the West's values here are very much on the up for examination as well. It's a very strong test.
Yeah, it's a good point. I suspect we'll hear more about that this week from Washington as well. Thank you all very much for joining us. Next week we will be live from Washington after the Prime Minister's official visit. We're looking forward to checking out the chaotic political situation over there at the moment too. Now finally, this one needs a little context. We were off air last summer when the former Deputy Prime Minister had a pretty bad experience with some kava during a visit to Micronesia. Some might have missed that unfortunate episode, but Anthony Albanese wasn't letting Michael McCormack forget about it this week during a visit from Fiji's Prime Minister. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
It is indeed an honour to welcome the Fijian Prime Minister Sitiveni Rabuka here today with us. I thank you again, Prime Minister, for welcoming me so warmly to Fiji with a traditional ceremony which, yes, the previous speaker might like to note, did include kava between earlier this year.
Don't drink the whole bowl.
And I was fine because they make us tough in Marrickville.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.